Buenos dias. Mi amo Dr. Gina Sosa, but you can call me Gina because everybody knows me as Gina. I'm a midwife in the UK. I'm a lecturer at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, which is in the UK. I've been a midwife for 25 years and I've worked clinically, I've worked in management and governance, and now, like I said, I'm teaching. Research has been in the heart of my work right from the beginning, and my passion started with the subject, actually, female genital mutilation. Because where I was working in London, there were many women coming to our maternity services with FGM. And so I started looking at the research because I was querying whether the care that we was actually giving was correct. And then I became an expert and specialised in the field and started teaching doctors and midwives and all sorts of health professionals and police and social services in the community. I also started with a colleague an African Well Women clinic that provided services for women who had had female genital mutilation. So we provided facilities to protect their daughters and also help to provide the woman to have a safer birth. So that really showed me the power of research, that it can change practice, not just my practice, but all of our practice. So today I'm hoping to give you a little taster of how you can read a paper. So academically, I've finished my PhD about 3 years ago. So research has been it continues to be very important for me. And I want to share some of that passion with you today. So reading a paper is a skill. We need to find an efficient way of doing it. I'm going to give you a starting point today, but this book is a must read if you want to learn how to be more critical with your thinking when reading a paper. There is a translation in Spanish too. Having the skill to critically read a paper is important because it matters what you read. The whole purpose of reading research papers is to increase our knowledge. Reading papers has the potential to improve our clinical practice. Knowledge has the potential to help us reflect on what we do and how we do it. There has been very poor research published in the past that has influenced clinical practice and caused harm to the public receiving medical and maternity care. This is still happening. We need to be critical about what we read. There's still research out there that's trying to change practice, like for instance, the vaginal mesh. There is so much debate on whether this is a safe treatment or not. When you have a paper in front of you, think, why am I reading this paper? This will influence how you will read it. Are you attempting to answer a clinical question, or are you interested in the topic? If you have an academic objective to search for papers in a certain field, there are frameworks that you can use to choose papers, but that is another presentation for another day. For now, we're going to take it that you have a paper in front of you and you want to critically read that paper so that you can make a judgment as to whether the knowledge gained should be taken seriously and influence changes in your practice. Most papers will be divided into these titles. When you write a paper, you will also be expected to include these titles. See, I've got loads of hope in you guys that you're not only going to be reading, but you're going to be progressing to writing papers. So you're going to have the title, abstract, introduction, methods, findings, discussion, and conclusion. So the introduction part is why. Why do we need the information presented? The methods is the how. How did the researchers get the information? The findings is the what. What did the researchers find? The discussion is the so what. So what we have this information? Why do we need it? And the conclusion is, now what? Now what do we do with the information? And we have to thank Greenhouse for this breakdown. When reading your paper, to start, carefully read the title, abstract, and introduction. Referring to the title, this will be the one thing that draws you in. Together, the title, the abstract, and the introduction sets the scene of the paper. It also provides concise information about the methods used and what researchers have found. Lastly, there's a summing up why the research is important and its future implications to clinical practice. If this first stage draws your interest, also look over the references too. If this is an area that you have completed a lot of reading, check if there are new references that you've not come across before in the literature search. This first process should be a fast process and really shouldn't take more than about 5 minutes, because if you actually do have an area that you want to do a literature search, you will need to look at hundreds of papers sometimes. So this first stage, the first sieving of the papers, the first sorting out of the papers, you need a fast process to think whether this paper is applicable to what you need. You have gone through the title, the abstract, and the introduction, and you still feel you want to progress reading with this paper. The next step is to look deeper into the paper so that we can critically read it. You need to go back to the introduction. You need to start again, and this time you've got to go more in depth. This is the time to identify and challenge assumptions of the authors. Consider whether the authors have demonstrated a good breadth of information to provide context as to why the subject is being investigated. Why is it important, this subject? The introduction usually finishes with a statement identifying a gap in the knowledge and the research. There will also be a research question by the authors. The authors then aim to fill this knowledge gap and answer the research question. At this point, you will need to consider, are you convinced by the research and knowledge gap and research question? Do not take it for granted that the researchers are correct. If you have read many papers on this subject, again, you may recognize some of the authors that have been referenced. You may want to look at some of the references later. You may even identify if a well-known researcher has been missed from this reference list. When preparing to critique the design, you, as the reader, needs to appreciate the different ways researchers collect data to gain knowledge to answer their research questions. I say this as there are many researchers and readers of research that only trust and hold value in research that includes large numbers comparing treatments. For example, randomized controlled trials are regarded as the gold standard when collecting and providing new evidence relating to clinical practice. As you can see in this pyramid, the pinnacle of evidence is portrayed as the systematic reviews and meta-analysis. Systematic reviews and meta-analysis bring together randomized controlled trials that answer the same or similar research questions. Again, the result is much greater numbers. These larger numbers are seen to make the research process and findings more reliable. I would encourage you, however, to be more open-minded about all types of research methodologies. Going back to the pyramid, Greenhalgh explains that the term level of evidence refers to what degree that information can be trusted based on study design when considering the introduction of a therapy. The trust in this pyramid is connected to the vigorous processes of critical analysis. Note, however, qualitative data is not included, which explores, interprets, and obtains a deeper understanding of a particular clinical phenomenon through observations, interviews, or focus groups, or a combination. Although there is a hierarchy of evidence, the main question is whether the correct methodology has been used to answer the research question. So Greenhalgh reminds us there has been bad systematic reviews and bad meta-analysis in the past. So we don't just concentrate on this pyramid of evidence. We critique the paper and find out for ourselves if we value the information that is coming from this paper and if they've used the right methodology to answer the research question and fill that knowledge gap. So now we need to critically look at the design, and this is the longest part. Firstly, are we looking at a primary or secondary research? So primary research means that it's an experiment. It's a randomized controlled trial or other sorts of controlled clinical trials, or a cohort study, or a case control study, or a cross-sectional survey, a longitudinal survey, a case report, or a case series, and observations and focus groups and interviews. Or is it secondary research? So is it a simple overview, a systematic review, a meta-analysis, a meta-synthesis, a decision analysis, a guideline development, or an economic analysis? Again, it would need another session to go through all of these research methodologies. Once you know the methodology, you will know if the researchers have taken a quantitative or a qualitative approach. Quantitative is all about counting and measuring, concentrating on finding the one truth. Quantitative researchers strive to ensure there are the least amount of variables that can affect their result. They like it to be as clean as possible. Whereas qualitative researchers seek a deeper truth, and they are aware that there are many truths. They have an appreciation that there are many truths from different perspectives. Qualitative researchers complete their research in the natural setting. Quantitative researchers usually start with a hypothesis, which is an idea. The intention is either to prove or disapprove the idea. Qualitative research do not start with an idea of the results. Their approach is to explore, to find ideas. Such ideas can be the future hypothesis for future quantitative studies. So whether it is quantitative or qualitative, you need to look at your participants in their study, in the paper that you have in front of you. How were the participants recruited? How many participants were recruited and why? within randomized controlled trials, how were the participants randomized? Were the participants blind to the treatment? Were the professionals blinded to the treatments? Were the researchers blinded to the treatment when they were analysing the data? Also, were the randomised groups similar? Then you need to look at who was in the study and why. And who was excluded from the study and why? What setting was used, and was this justified? Were the participants studied in real-life circumstances? Is there a sense of a relationship between the researcher and the research participants? In qualitative research, this is very important, because when you're doing observations or doing interviews, there has to be a sense of trust. But you need to have a balance, because if there's too much trust, then sometimes the researcher can have so much empathy for those that they're researching that actually they become biased, and they even sometimes become native, which translates as the researcher becoming part of the group that they're studying. So now you need to assess the ethics of the study. Has ethical approval been granted? The study shouldn't cause any harm to research participants. So can you see if there's any evidence that the researchers have protected the well-being of the research participants? For example, I was in a research group that was trying to design a research that was interviewing women and their families about female genital mutilation. And there was an ethical dilemma that the participants could be criminalized if they started talking about FGM. Because if they admitted that one of their children had had FGM, actually we would have to report it to the police. So we had to think about the design of our research so that we could protect our participants, so that they could share their knowledge and experience of living with FGM without being criminalized. So going back to your paper, is there sufficient information about how the research was discussed with the research participants? Was there a discussion accompanied by literature provided to the research participants to read? Is there evidence that the research participants gave full consent? And check the timing of that consent as well. Was it appropriate? For instance, when I was doing my PhD, I was observing women in labour. So it wasn't ethical for me to ask for consent when the woman was already in labour. So permission for the study, the consent for the study, was requested in the woman's pregnancy rather than in labour. Now, the third section of looking at the design is, what were the outcomes to be measured? Or are there any outcomes to be measured? What methods were used to collect the data? So when we're looking at methods, we're thinking about interviews or observations, or was it that the research participants were receiving a treatment and it was being compared with another treatment? So going back to what you're looking at, were the research tools shared? So if they had a questionnaire, have they shared anything about the questions that were on that questionnaire? If they had interview questions that were very broad, have they shared those questions with you? When answering all these questions, you should be able to answer another question that Greenhalgh advises, and that is whether the design was appropriate for the research question. You should be in a position now with all this information to answer that. Now, we've got to think about the findings. Within quantitative research, do not worry if you cannot understand all the calculations performed, as the authors explain the findings in the discussion section. Calculations in quantitative research are crucial to show its reliability, meaning that if the research was repeated, there is a statistical evidence you would get the same result. It is worth, however, learning some basics concerning statistics. Look up the terminology such as confidence intervals. Quantitative studies such as randomized controlled trials use them. It shows how precise the data is. The confidence interval should be at least 95%. This means that there is a 95% confidence that the ranges of values presented contain the true mean of the population. Calculations are not required in qualitative research, as there is not an expectation that findings would be repeated in a subsequent studies. There is an appreciation that the findings reported cannot be generalized. It is acknowledged that timing, time, context, population can change the understanding of a phenomena under study. Thinking about the discussion section, think if there is sufficient data to support the findings presented. This is relevant to qualitative and quantitative data. Check 2. Is there any data that contradicts the main findings? In the end, did the findings answer the research question that the authors first proposed? Now we look at the discussion section. Has the discussion section translated the findings and compared with other studies? If you are well read in the phenomena, the subject, are the findings consistent with other studies? Are there any contrasts? If so, why? Does the study add extra information to existing knowledge of the subject? Are there suggestions about where future research is required in the subject? Overall, are you convinced of the research findings and how it fits into research that has been done previously? Whether the answer is yes or no, think why. Sometimes the researcher's perspective is obvious, but it's not acknowledged by the authors. So check, is there researcher bias? Check throughout the paper, has the author as a researcher critically analysed their role of how they have influenced the research process? Many researchers use reflexivity as an important part of their research process, starting in the planning stage and continuing when describing, analysing and translating their raw data. For example, when I was doing my research and I was in the research field doing observations, I had to be very aware as a midwife. I was there as a researcher, but my clinical hat kept coming on, and also my management hat and my governance too. So it did affect the way I translated what I was seeing. So I had to write down and be aware of my own perspective when I was doing these observations and translating the data. So in the end, what can you do with all this information? If it's quantitative research, can it be generalized to the population? Are you convinced that it can be generalized? If it's a qualitative research, then the intention wouldn't be to generalize, but it could maybe transfer the findings to a setting. So it would be for the reader to read the paper and then make a decision for themselves whether the research findings represented the place that they worked. For example, when I was doing my research in a midwife-led unit and in home births, there were some things that could be very similar in other home births and in other midwife-led units where midwives work. So, in the end, what is your overall impression? Think whether the authors solved the right issue. And have they solved it in the best way? Are the assumptions the authors make reasonable? Was the appropriate data collected? What do you think are the strengths of the paper? What are the limitations? And no paper is perfect, so researchers usually have a section in their paper to be clear about their limitations and be open and honest about them, because things do happen in research that you wasn't expecting. So you need to show how you manage those situations. And maybe if you had your time again doing the research, you would do it differently. But you had your research design and then you went with it. And now it's to be open-minded to think how maybe you could have improved it. So you've read your paper, you've made up your mind now, following your overall impression. Once you've completed this process, you are ready to go forth with a decision about whether this paper will influence your clinical practice. I hope this session has provided you a basic introduction into how to critically read a paper. So all I can do at this stage is wish you luck, good luck, and go forth and make practice better. Muchas gracias. Thank you. Bye.